All right, I'm going to tell you something here, but you got to promise me you're not going to tell anybody else, especially real photographers, pro photographers, fine art photographers. Please keep this to yourself. So I went on this really amazing road trip with my family. Honestly, going into it, I had high hopes that I never should have had. Also, some hesitation. How is this going to be traveling in a van with my wife and my 4 kids? Is this going to be a nightmare, a disaster? What's going to go wrong? Is the weather going to be horrible? Are ferries going to burn in the water? By the way, ferries were burning in the water on this trip, the exact ferries that we were supposed to be on. And I just thought, man, I want this trip to be so good, and there's so much working against us. So here we are. It's basically day 2. It's probably day 3 or 4 of our vacation by now, but it's like day 2 of really serious getting up and shooting. And so yesterday, in terms of these photos, yesterday I got up 5 a.m., hauled myself out of bed, fired up the jet boil, made myself a coffee in the French press, and walked away from our campsite, into town, into where the harbor is, with my coffee and my camera, my Fuji and my 35mm lens. It was low tide. The boats were, or was it? I forget. No, you know what? I don't think it was low tide. No, it wasn't low tide. And I barely even took any pictures. And I thought, man, this place is so beautiful. And I don't know. I don't know. I took pictures and I didn't care. You know, I'm on this amazing trip and this is supposed to be so awesome, and I just didn't care. The next morning, this morning, here in these pictures, again, I haul myself out of bed around 5 in the morning to beat the sunrise, and I drive out and then hike out to this lighthouse. And I'm waiting for the sunrise, and the sun rises, and I'm snapping photos, and I'm not excited because I swear these photos are not expressing the way it feels. They are not expressing my hope. They are not expressing the way I feel about this. These photos don't look the way it feels. They don't look the way I feel. If I was writing a story, it wouldn't be once upon a time, a guy was out walking and he took a picture. And the picture was pretty good. It was a nice little picture. I would be like, once upon a time, oh my goodness, this guy was falling off the cliff and he was taking pictures and it was so amazing and everything was so saturated and the sunlight was so amazing and everything was awesome. But that's not how these pictures look, you know? Like, why can't pictures just look the way we feel? And so I did this thing where I thought I got some shots like this. And then I thought ooh, I can switch my camera to panorama mode. Now I can snap a bunch of photos and stitch them together later in Lightroom, and that's okay. I did that. But then I can also use the panorama mode to get pictures like this so that I can show people in the moment, oh, look what I saw this morning when I was out at 5 o'clock when you were still in bed sleeping. You want to come out with me tomorrow? And so I can show people stuff like this. Now, as I was switching through going from panorama mode back to normal mode, something happened. I accidentally clicked on a fancy little filter in my camera, and the scene right before my eyes changed from this dull thing to this. And I tell you, my heart skipped a beat, and I came alive. This is the moment where my photography changed forever. Now, I'm only a couple weeks removed from this event, but I can promise you, my photography is never going to look or feel the same ever again after this moment. So what happened? So my camera, my Fuji camera, comes with a number of effects where you can take the picture and it's got this built-in effect. And they call this miniature. And you'll see as I go through a few photos, it will give, and if you watched my photo walk at the harbor, the photo walk video at the harbor, you'll see a lot more about how photos look in miniature mode. And essentially, if I'm not mistaken, it mimics a tilt shift lens. But what it does is it deeply saturates the photos. Actually, it works more with vibrance than saturation, and those two things are different. Vibrance, if I understand correctly, brings out the saturation in any of the colors in your photos that aren't very saturated already, vibrance will bring them out without affecting the colors that are already very saturated. Whereas saturation just saturates everything. Even if it's already oversaturated, it just saturates it even more. So it really brings out a lot of vibrance, a little bit of saturation, contrast. There's a deep contrast here in the photo, and it really plays with the warms and the cools in your photos, so you can get a really good warm, cool contrast. I think you see that in the water and the warm sunlight here on the grass. And I call it toy camera because it's this very imperfect look to your photo. It looks like you've got some, a strange film stock, in a really cheap camera with a lens that doesn't focus properly on things. And to me, all right, let me just bring up my flagged photos so that you can just see a whole bunch of these photos I was taking. You can see the basic effect. Then I want to tell you why I care so much about this, what this means to me. Look at this. Look how things will look. Now, this is straight out of the camera. All these photos are straight out of the camera. This is me taking the corresponding RAW file and then trying to mimic the effect. And you can see that I haven't quite got it, but it's close. It's like 80% there. So I'm learning how to mimic this effect so that even if I'm not shooting with this effect, I can edit with it later if the photo calls for it. But look at this. Look at how it does make things look miniature. And I'm trying to figure out in what circumstances this effect works best. I can tell you it works best in good sunlight, not so much on an overcast day. And there needs to be something in the background and something in the foreground. The less there is in the photo, the more difficult it is to achieve that miniature kind of look, but it still is a really cool look. I just love, I'm telling you, I came alive. So people will talk about inspiration, and they will talk about, this myth of inspiration where, just wait till you feel inspired and then go out and do it. For most of us, that's BS. It just doesn't work. You need to get out there and do the work so that when the muse shows up, when you are struck by inspiration, you are already working. And this was the moment where I was rewarded, where basically, the muse showed up and said, here's a guy who's hauled himself out of bed at least twice, hauled his family across the country at this point, hauled himself out of bed as exhausted as he was before the sun came up, went out to explore new areas. He's on day 2. Day 1 was a flop. Day 1 was a failure, and he still got up and he did it again. And the muse said, all right, you've earned it. You get this. You're allowed to have this now. Here, put your camera on miniature mode, and all of a sudden, your whole photographic life is about to change in this moment. And that first picture that I showed you was the moment. You're gonna see me produce, whether or not you like it, I don't know, but you are going to see me produce some incredible collections of photos. And that was the exact moment when it happened, when I discovered this effect. So all kinds of things here. I'm just kind of experimenting at this point, seeing how does it look, in all these different scenarios. You can see that sometimes you can hardly tell I'm using the effect, and other times you can tell for sure that I am. Look at how it's going to make the pebbles in a second when I get there. Just so cool looking. So cool. Man. And so here's what it did to me. Think about writing and think about the different genres, okay? And think about fantasy. So fantasy, we see issues from our real life, our world, issues from our world, issues from our personal life, transported into another world, and you deal with them in another world. And that's kind of what we do on a road trip, isn't it? It's kind of what we do on our travels. We go and experience a different world, but we're there, in my case, with my family. We still got to go through all the issues. We have a 3-year-old, okay, so we have to deal with somebody who every time you're setting up a shot, every time you're doing something important, every time you've hiked yourself 2 kilometers down the shoreline, she says, I have to go poop. I tell you, like 100 times on this road trip, she had to go poop at the worst moment possible. And, you're still dealing with all your shit, but you're dealing with them in another world. and you see things get worked out in this fantasy world, this world that is very different from the world you're in. So we're in a very different world from ours. Everything was different. The grocery shopping, the gas, everything, the whole way of life was different for these people on this trip. And we got to go experience that. We got to go deal with our personal issues and our family issues and our cultural issues in another world. But my photographs weren't reflecting that. My photographs didn't feel like a fantasy. And even though this is a very realistic fantasy for us, the road trip is a realistic fantasy, it's still, the pictures weren't feeling like that. The pictures were feeling normal and mundane. I mean, we were cooking our breakfast over a fire. It doesn't get better than that. And my pictures didn't look like it until I took this picture, and all of a sudden I said, yes, this is how breakfast feels. This right here, miniature mode, which I'm going to just refer to as toy camera mode, because I also have a toy camera mode and it looks similar, but it's a little bit overdone because there's a vignette on it, and I really don't like the vignette, but it looks very similar. Toy camera mode on my Fujifilm camera. I'm always going to have a Fujifilm, even if I switch over to another camera brand, which I probably will, for various reasons. Mostly because I like my pictures to focus when I press the button, and Fuji hasn't figured out how to autofocus their cameras. But I will always have a Fuji camera for this effect. I will always have a Fuji camera and a 35mm lens. And because this is the fantasy genre. Look, when I write stories, I choose a genre, the genre that best expresses the story I'm trying to tell. And when I take pictures, I want a certain look or style or feel or aesthetic that represents the story I'm trying to tell, or the point I'm trying to get across, or what it is I'm trying to show you. I want to show you how breakfast feels on the road, and this does it. The flat, boring, original photo that I took for the first 2 or 3 days didn't do it. This does it. This is what life on the road looks like. It's what it feels like. I don't care. Yes, it's a little oversaturated. And by the way, what exactly is oversaturated? So I wrote a bunch of photography articles for a website, and one day I got a troll who left 40 comments. Okay, 40 comments is a little bit over the top. You don't have to like my article. You don't have to like my pictures. You can even leave a comment saying, I don't like your article and I don't like your pictures. And that's okay. That's totally fair. Bonus points for you if you tell me, sort of why you didn't like it, if you can express that. It can be difficult to express why we don't like something. Sometimes it's like, I just don't. But if you're going to leave a comment, try. And extra bonus points if you give me tips about how it could be better. But shame on you if you're going to leave 40 repetitive comments about how terrible the photos are and how terrible the people are in my photos. I mean, the personal insults, it was over the top. And my editor finally did something about it, finally, deleted the comments, left a couple of the comments, which is totally fine, because go ahead and leave a couple nasty comments. It's the internet, it's fair game. But again, bonus points if you can be constructive while you're insulting me. But later on, my editor rejected some of my photos and said, based on what happened last time, because apparently she decided to take the troll seriously, based on what happened last time, let's make sure your pictures are perfect. And she sent one back saying it was oversaturated. And I was offended. And I shouldn't have been, but I was, and I'm glad that I felt offended. I've dealt with those feelings down. It's not the way I would feel if the same thing happened today, because the same sort of thing has happened, and it's perfectly fine. But I felt offended, and I got really defensive, and I said, look, my photos reflect my real experience of life, and life is gritty, and life is messy, and life can be a little bit out of focus, and and that moment, the color, this photo, I don't know, you might think it's oversaturated, but that's why every person who loves this photo, because of the colors in the photo. And so here's a question for you. what is oversaturated anyways? What if we could do a scientific test that was indisputable, which there's no such thing as a scientific test that's indisputable. That's why we have scientific revolutions every couple generations, precisely because science is so disputable. But what if we could perform a test and we could see that your eyes see the world more saturated than my eyes do? Would we say that your eyes are oversaturated? Or would we say that my eyes are undersaturated? Would we say whose eyes are right? Your eyes or my eyes? And what if we find somebody else whose eyes are more saturated than yours, and somebody else whose eyes are less saturated than mine? I mean, where are we? What is the real truth about saturation? And how about this? Have you ever heard somebody say, look at a beautiful sunrise or beautiful sunset and say, they grumble and say, a sunset would be a lot nicer if it was less saturated, if the colors were less vibrant, if this, nobody says that, right? The reason that we stand in awe of a sunrise or a sunset is because it's so saturated, because it's so vibrant, because we get a glimpse of something. We see the sky in a way that we don't normally get to see it. Is this photo oversaturated? Yes, it is. Are all of these photos oversaturated? No. I would say this photo is a slight bit oversaturated. I could tone down the vibrance a little bit here. Actually that's a little much, but now it's under. But these photos get to within 80 to 90% of how this trip felt, how this road trip felt. It now looks the way it feels. And for the rest of the trip, for the rest of the 2 weeks, I felt like a kid with a camera again. I felt like my 10-year-old self. My 10-year-old self who scrimped and saved and worked so hard for my first camera only for it to be defective, only for it to completely ruin my first roll of film. The little kid who shot pictures and whose pictures never came out looking the way things felt, who always ended up with these crappy looking photos. And finally, I hit this moment on the trip where the muse showed up and said, oh, you're out here working, are you? You're working even though you are completely uninspired, even though your photos are just looking like crap, even though your photos are completely incapable of expressing the way it feels to be out here at 5:30 in the morning alone, wondering if wild animal, if one of the wildcats is going to come out of the woods and pounce on you. I mean, I'm walking along game trails, and my photos are not expressing the way it feels. And finally they do. Finally, by accident, maybe accident, maybe just a happy accident, maybe because I was out there working and the muse rewarded me, and my photography on this trip changed. The photography for the rest of my life has changed. So that's toy camera mode. That's the secret behind my photos. Hey, look at that. Broccoli. If you can make broccoli look magical, man, you got something.